Welcome to the darkness underneath. The following episode includes a murder committed by the DeMeo crew that hasn't been discussed in prior literature, set briefly in a biography on Anthony Casso by Philip Carlo, in which the author didn't know many details. To protect their interest, I want to emphasize that neither Peter Lafrocia, the Gemini twins, nor any surviving family members of the DeMeo crew have leaked this police information. I have a massive amount of sources, and further details of this hit and many more will be explored in my book. Furthermore, any discrepancy between my book and older episodes of this series of Murder Machine is because in my exploration of this story, I found out new information from valid sources that contradict the old. Finally, somebody died recently, and so this episode is dedicated to Chuck Rothberg, my favorite member of the Four Directions, of which Dominic Montiglio was a member of. Chuck was classy, intelligent, and kind. He loved jazz, cigarettes, and women, and in that order. I miss you, Chuck. Freddy drove along the turnpike, with Roy in the passenger seat and Vito sitting in back. They were headed to the Harem Spa in Bricktown, New Jersey. In the car, Roy sifted through Kenny Mccabe's files on the crew. Roy had gotten the files through the Long Island detective Freddy had been hanging out with recently. Robert Gately. Roy didn't like that Freddy was getting cozy with a detective Roy didn't know. Maybe this detective Gately was manipulating Freddy, since Freddy could easily be fooled sometimes. Still, Roy was getting desperate now. Most of his crooked contacts weren't available anymore, and Roy knew somebody among his group were snitching. If these were McCabe's files, they should tell him some of what Kenny knows about Roy's rackets and other crimes. Because McCabe, he was becoming a real problem, not just for Roy.
Roy sifted through the files, and he suddenly began trembling.
"Knows about the murders!" Roy bellowed. Enraged, DeMeo tore apart McCabe's offending papers, tossing them out the window where they scattered along the highway, as though he could leave their memory behind.
Although Roy didn't know it, Mccabe had given Gately his files willingly. Mccabe was trying to discourage Roy and even break him down so that he'd consider flipping in the future. The detective could tell from the bantering that he had with Roy outside the Gemini Lounge and the Veterans and Friends that Roy wasn't so cocky anymore, that he seemed to be drinking too much, that Roy was getting weaker. But if McCabe and Nelson knew Roy and his crew had committed over a dozen murders, far more than that actually, well, that would be enough to send Roy to prison for the rest of his life. And that terrified Roy. It meant there was a snitch, probably more than one of them, among the associates and maybe even his own crew member. Roy had to find out who this rat was and squeeze his neck until it snapped. But who was it? A lot of people in the underworld might know about some of the murders that Roy committed. He was infamous at this point.
Now, even after sharing McCabe's files, Roy wasn't sure if this Detective Gately asshole was really helping them out, or if he was only pretending to get secrets from the crew. But Roy was about to figure that out. Not long after, Freddy told Gately and a couple of other wise guys that these cops, Kenny and Nelson, kept showing up at Roy's lounge, and that they had been upsetting Roy a lot lately. Then Freddy boasted that he could take both those guys out for Roy if he had to.
"I know where Nelson and Kenny live. I know where Nelson's got a wife, and I know that Kenny has a wife and a son named Kenny Jr. Kenny keeps his files in the basement. I could kill Kenny and his family."
Uh-oh. The only way that Freddy could know this level of information was if there was a blue snitch in the DA's office, or at least a snitch with connections to the DA, probably a cop or a prosecutor. Since Calabro was dead and Doherty retired, that snitch was probably Blau. Freddy had just dry snitched and given away one of Roy's weapons. Freddy hadn't really been thinking when those two marbles rolling around in his head that passed for a brain had clicked together and he had made that boast. If Gately turned out to be a good cop who was fooling Freddy, which he obviously was, Freddy had gone too far by threatening Kenny's family. Now, as a side note, I can't emphasize enough that McCabe was known as the good cop. In fact, he's probably the closest to my ideal of what a cop should be. Kenny was like a lawful good paladin in Dungeons & Dragons, for those of you who were kind of dorky in high school. Pete LaFroche and the Gemini twins will praise McCabe to this day for how fair he treated them. In the book Mafia Cop, that mentally defective dirtbag Louis Eppolito actually ridicules McCabe because he interceded and remonstrated him for abusing suspects, like that's a bad thing. McCabe was usually as calm and analytical as Sigmund Freud and as difficult to rattle as an elephant. Everybody has told me that. But that day, for reasons I could more than understand, McCabe finally came precariously close to losing his cool. Immediately upon learning that Freddy had threatened McCabe's family and that he knew all these details, McCabe met up with Agent Anthony Nelson, and they rushed over to the Gemini Lounge in an unmarked FBI car. On the way, Nelson was a little worried. McCabe, well, he might lose his temper, and Nelson didn't want him doing anything that was going to get himself in trouble or seriously hurting anybody. Just a few blocks from the lounge, they spotted their target, Freddy. He was ambling towards his car, completely oblivious. And they followed him a little ways, just far enough to where there wouldn't be much chance of being spotted. Then, Agent Nelson rolled up to Freddy and shouted,
"Hey, Freddy, get in the car. We're going for a ride."
Freddy glanced over nervously. And then he clambered into the back seat where Kenny was sitting, his ruddy face now so red from rage that he looked like a cherry. And he glowered down at Freddy, who was starting to wonder if he was ever going to leave this car. After berating Freddy for the next maybe 30 minutes, Freddy's machismo melted like an ice cube in a frying pan, and Freddy squealed, "I'm sorry, I just got carried away." "Freddy, if you ever come after my family, I'll forget I'm a cop," Mccabe thundered. Freddy, well, he's quivering now. He eagerly promised them not to. But before they dropped Freddy off again, Freddy let them know just how afraid of Roy he was. "Please don't tell Roy I upset you guys. He doesn't want me pissing off no cops. He'll make me do the Houdini," Freddy cried. They weren't going to say anything to Roy, and they didn't have to worry about Freddy ever threatening them again or their families. But that had been the conclusion of Detective Gately's undercover work. Now Freddy knew that he had been boasting to an honest cop. All in all, Freddy made it away from the situation fairly unscathed. Had he said that about Joe Coffey's family and Coffey had found out about it, well, he would have probably walked away with 2 black eyes instead of just a stern lecture. And apparently it doesn't seem like Roy ever found out the details of the incident, though I'm not sure of that. And I have been wrong in my conclusions before, which led to me having to edit a lot. He did, of course, probably find out about Gately fooling Freddy, since Freddy had to have eventually explained why his new cop friend was no longer his pal. And during this period, which was 1981, Roy had been angry at Freddy a lot for his clownish impulsivity. This is during a period when the cops are really coming down on Roy. And Roy would shout and threaten Freddy until Freddy was in near tears. But as much as Freddy pissed Roy off, and as much as Roy blustered about what an idiot Freddy was and how he'd Houdini him when he was castigating Freddy, Roy did seem to care about Freddy as much as he cared about people in his own distorted sociopathic way. These guys aren't healthy after all. And Freddy in turn worshipped Roy, who'd given him such a sense of purpose and confidence. Now, Freddy's family, besides Richie, weren't big fans of Roy. 1980, an older brother, who was never mentioned in Murder Machine, he wasn't part of the mob or Roy's outfit, he died from drinking to death, loathing Roy. He considered Roy a monster who was destroying his family by leading Freddy and Richie into such a diabolical enterprise. Freddy and Richie's dad, I'm going to call him Elder DeMeo. Elder DeMeo despised Roy by the end. Freddy and Roy used to come over to Elder DeMeo's house to have dinner on Fridays every night before they headed over to the lounge to do their shape-up nights. And the Elder DeMeo, well, he always knew Roy was shady, he just didn't realize just how messed up Roy was. But by the early 80s, the Elder DeMeo was fantasizing about shooting Roy. He'd come to disdain him, because Roy was either going to get Freddy and Richie in prison for the rest of their lives, or they were going to get killed. Sure, Richie and Freddy made their own poor decisions, and Roy didn't take their moral responsibility away from them. And yeah, Freddy was always troubled, let's be honest here. But neither Freddy nor Richie would probably have made those decisions were it not for Roy's criminal aspirations. I'm bringing this up because it's important to remember that despite his moments of affability and generosity, Roy was a very troubled, selfish, and destructive individual, and his destructiveness was becoming increasingly harmful to those easily influenced by him. By April 1981, Veto Arena had been missing in action for almost a year. He had just left. And Roy wasn't sure who the fucking rats were that were snitching on him about his car ring, drugs, and worst of all, the murders, but he was pretty sure that Vito was saying something to somebody. That summer prior, somebody had called after the Operation Empire Boulevard raid and ratted on Henry. Then they had snitched on Freddy. And it just so happened that Vito left, and Vito had been fighting with those two right before he left. Henry and Freddy hadn't liked Vito because he was ridiculously lazy and would go directly behind their backs to Roy and whine for a larger cut of their combined earnings than he actually deserved. That is, as much as anybody deserves anything for stealing cars. Vito was, in the words of Detective Harry Brady, a flavorful guy, and what he meant by that was Vito was clownishly self-centered, weird, repulsive, and demanding. And so, in recent months, Henry and Freddy had been arrested. Roy had procured his lawyer, Shargell, and they were trying to keep them from doing too much time in prison. As far as the investigation into the rest of the crew went, well, Walter Mack, who was the assistant DA, he's working with Bruce Mao, who's in charge of the Gambino portion of the FBI. And this is all just revisiting what I told you already. Artie Ruffels, Agent Artie Ruffels, has now come aboard, and he's working with Kenny Mccabe, as well as Murphy, Brady, and the rest of them. Joe Windling was there too. He was a detective with the DA. He wasn't as crucial as, say, Kenny Mccabe, obviously, but he was helping Kenny Mccabe when he could. Now, the legendary homicide detective Frank Pergola, who I interviewed in other videos, he'd be recruited very soon, just not quite yet, into Walter Mack's force. The NYPD wanted recognition for an operation this big with a lot of murders, and if they only had auto-detect cops working with the DA at this time, well, they were worried that they wouldn't get any of the credit for solving these homicides. Not even though it had been Murphy that had solved quite a few homicides, at least, the first 25 or so, with Harry Brady's help. By now, the cops were watching them all the time, interrupting family gatherings, sometimes detaining the crew just to make them uncomfortable. Roy was drinking more and more. Most of the crew were high on cocaine and lewds all the time. Coke was overwhelming many members of the crew. Anthony Center's normally impressive-looking physique was starting to become pale and emaciated, and his eyes were oftentimes wild and delirious. Around this time, Anthony was arrested after speeding when a detective found a gun and cocaine in his car. At the time, Anthony had just been trying to defend a friend in a dispute with a bunch of rambunctious and hostile teenagers. And so Anthony, he'd been sentenced to a year in prison. Anthony's sentence had been suspended, so he was still out. Then there was the trial against Mastrangelo, Roy's associate, who helped him procure equipment for Terry's Dream, that shrimp boat that had been raided, which had been part of his, Anthony Casso's, and other major mob players' scheme to smuggle marijuana and lewds into New York City. Mastrangelo had also been caught on a wiretap by Joseph Bennett, an honest businessman dealer who had procured some trucks from Mastrangelo that he had used. Bennett was in New York City at this time and was a witness against his former customer. He would be coming to the federal Brooklyn courthouse to testify against Mastrangelo. Now, the government already had the wiretappings. Bennett's testimony probably wasn't even crucial anymore, but it was important enough for him to be in town from Florida and further solidify the case. And sure enough, the prosecutor in charge, I'm not going to name him, had been kind of incompetent and didn't bother to even offer Bennett any protection when he walked to the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse that morning. Frank Lastarino and Joseph Bennett's shady nephew both made some calls and found out where Uncle Bennett was and what his route was to the courthouse. Roy was ecstatic when he heard from Big Frank and Anthony Casso who relayed the information. Although Joseph Bennett wasn't actually a rat, he never had any reason to be loyal to the mob. He was a hard-working, honest citizen like Roy's dad had been. Roy and Gaspipe weren't worried about that. They were worried about whether you had done anything to interfere with their illicit business that might put them at risk. The longer this trial went on, the more likely it might expose his name, and that secret would get back to Castellano, who would then have him whacked for selling drugs. It was April 19th. And around 11 in the morning, an innocuous 65-year-old man with gray hair made his way along an intersection on Avenue Inn in Flatbush. There were dozens of people bustling along the sidewalks past him. To and from work, cars honked and trundled along the busy streets. Joseph James Bennett was headed to the federal Brooklyn courthouse. He was set to testify in 3 hours. Although when he started to cross the intersection, he never realized that he would never reach the other side. A car had been following him. Suddenly it stopped and 2 men leaped out. The slightly taller of the two was concealed with a ski mask. The other wore a distracting floppy hat that was pulled down just above his eyes, and his chiseled face remarkably resembled Joey Testa. These weren't guys practicing for Halloween. They were assassins, and they charged forward, firing round after round into their mark's back and face. Joseph Bennett, he toppled over, dead almost immediately. More gunshots rang out. "Oh, fuck!" An off-duty cop or corrections officer had noticed from another car and was firing at them. The two DeMeo crew members returned shot after shot and began fleeing. Their getaway car had been driven by another masked assailant, and he hadn't been able to stay, especially with that cop nearby. He didn't want to get caught. Instead, the killers fled along foot, all down the avenue, firing shot after shot, until they were eventually able to swing open the unlocked door of a car with a woman driving, shoved her to the side, and accelerated off. It's been a very close call. Something like out of the movie Heat. And when word got back to court of what just happened, well, they locked the room down, and everybody turned their eyes with alarm and suspicion at Mastrangelo, who sat at the defendant's chair, stoically as a statue. Although Bennett's hit had been a success, it had also been a mistake. Murdering a federal witness had only enraged the authorities. They already had his wiretap. And who was going to benefit from this? Well, Mastrangelo. And who else? Well, whoever he was working for, which some of the informants said was Roy DeMeo. More than likely, Nino, on top of that, had neither been told nor approved this hit since it was a federal witness without much gain, and Nino understood full well how aggressively the government would investigate and prosecute the mob for going after a federal witness who had been a civilian. Nino, he usually was utilitarian about his victims, unless he had a personal vendetta against you. And so, yes, court testimony suggests Nino was angry at Roy for killing somebody else that didn't need to be whacked. Meanwhile, over the summer, Henry and Freddy were headed to trial on very serious charges. Roy pressured them both to make a plea bargain that would send Henry and Freddy away for about 5 years. But that meant he lost 2 more of his most loyal and efficient inner crew members, and now he only had a skeleton of his auto theft operation and crew left. They were pretty much decimated. Pete LaFroche had fled to Florida with Roy's permission after Coffey and Wendling began hounding him. And so the main inner crew members left included the Gemini twins, Rendini, Richie, Patty, and Carlo Profeta, who replaced Freddy as Roy's driver. Now, for months, Roy's whole crew had been looking for that fat fuck Vito, who he was sure was one of the rats. At Vito's old apartment, they had found some lurid nude pictures of him and Joey Lee together, along with some other trashy-looking guy. And they were in poses that would make most people, straight or gay, probably want to vomit, considering the shape these guys were in. And although Roy considered using those photos as blackmail to keep this guy silent, since he couldn't locate Vito, it didn't matter anyway. Eventually, Nino had been sent to prison. He could no longer delay his sentencing any longer, despite all his high-priced lawyers. But despite all his humiliating browbeating, which was almost as humiliating to Roy as Roy's bullying was to Freddy, Roy sort of missed Nino. Nino always seemed confident, you see. He always seemed like he knew just what to do. Nino was highly intelligent and strong, even if his strategies weren't as sophisticated as Roy's. And even if he wasn't as educated as Roy. On top of that, Nino had gone to prison livid with Roy for all his murders and fucking up and running off. He was supposed to have been helping Nino escape that night they did a hit on Jimmy the Clam. But more than anything, about the unrestrained murders that Roy had committed without his approval. So, ever eager to impress Nino again, who was really the only guy in a higher position at this point who liked or trusted Roy at all, Roy began contemplating how he might get Nino back out of prison. Eventually, Roy sent Joey and Anthony to talk to Judy May, that corrupt jury member who they had bribed the first time to get Nino a manslaughter charge. "We want you to tell him something that will get Nino a mistrial," Joey said. "We'll pay you for $25,000 again, if you do it," Anthony continued. "No, let's ask him for too much. For only $25,000? I want 50, Judy May said. When the twins told Roy about Judy May's counteroffer, Roy shrugged. "All right, it's for Nino. 50,000 it is." And so Judy May told the judge, who had been in charge of Nino's trial, that she'd observed evidence that one of the jury members was fucking one of the court officers when they had been sequestered. So Nino was released and there was going to be a retrial. although he risked getting an even more serious sentence than before. In the meantime, he was free again. So meanwhile, Roy had been trying to make up for his lost profits by changing his focus. Since he didn't have as much of his auto theft operation or his drug operation, he still had some of them, both of them. He was now focused on his porn business, and he was trying to take some of that off Doug Rega's hands without suspicion, his buildings and his equipment, because then he could have his own porn be made. On top of that, Roy had a dispute over weapons dealings, which I'll cover more in my book. I'm only going to just vaguely say here that it involved 3 more murders that might not have been necessary, in which Nino wasn't happy about either, and in which Roy killed most of a family. And so what happened to Vito during all of this? By the spring of 1982, Vito had vanished almost 2 years ago. At first, he and Joey Lee had fled to Florida, worried that Roy was going to make human sausage out of both of them and serve them up to the Fountain Avenue dump. But over time, Vito, who had complete control over Joey Lee, decided that being bored and broke was even worse than Roy. And so they secretly sneaked back into New York, and they stayed at a hotel in Suffolk County, Long Island. Since a regular job was too monotonous and a lot of hard work, Vito started robbing again. This time he was focused on dentists, and this went on for over a year. Joey Lee would pretend to be Vito's son, had a tooth problem, and Vito would come in with him, and then Vito would suddenly pull out a .45 while they were distracted, which is a large gun, one that was often used for the Gemini method, although the .380 was popular too. And then Vito and Joey Lee would tie up the administration and the dentist, and they would steal money and drugs. Apparently both of them were heavy into drugs, and whatever dentists have, I'm assuming pills, stimulants, and heroin. They were wanted in Long Island and Brooklyn for robbing dentists, a doctor, and a real estate agent in one incident. Eventually, they were content with just wanting money, so Vito and Joey Lee would stalk unsuspecting women next who were wearing expensive jewelry, especially wedding rings. And then they would ambush them, often in parking lots, while brandishing their .45 and a knife. The women, well, they'd be terrified and they'd immediately give up their jewelry. But in one incident, one woman couldn't get her ring off quickly enough, and so they grabbed her, kidnapped her, then they drove her to her home, and while she was sobbing, Vito violently pulled on her wedding ring and just kept pulling. He was yanking hard enough to where he could have broken her finger, but fortunately it came off. Then he tied the crying woman up, gagged her, and left her in a closet. Vito and Joey Lee had been getting away with this for months now. The only time they had been arrested was a year prior when they had been pulled over after a long car chase. But it was only a matter of time before the investigators caught this ridiculous version of Bonnie and Clyde. By the middle of '82, Detective Pergola was working for Sergeant Joe Coffey again, and they were both now affiliated with Walter Mack and looking for Veto Arena. Vito's name was still coming up on wiretaps. Sergeant Joe Coffey, who had a savage sense of humor, or what I would otherwise call my sense of humor, well, whenever he'd hear somebody mention Vito's name on the wiretaps or over the radio, Coffey would say excitedly, "Hey, it's that fat 300-pound slob again. We've got to catch this guy." The end of Vito and Joey Lee's crime spree came one rainy evening in Port Jefferson, Long Island, at the Good Earth Chinese restaurant. Vito was with his boyfriend, Joey Lee, when an off-duty robbery detective named Steve Marks noticed the hulking Weight Watcher's nightmare slurping down dumplings. Detective Marks, well, he'd been looking for these idiots for a long time, but right then it was his son's birthday party, and the last thing he wanted to do was get in a gunfight with his family and a bunch of pedestrians right around him. And so Marks quietly excused himself to the restroom, and then from a payphone called the officers to come for backup. He was going to have to wait for these guys to leave and hope that they didn't notice him. Half an hour later, Vito and Joey Lee tried to walk out into the dark drizzle, only to have the end of a .38 flung in their direction, and cops, including Marks, who was dressed in shorts, shouting at them to freeze or else they'd blow their fucking head off. Vito and Joey Lee didn't resist. They were handcuffed against the wall and taken to the squad cars. Cops searched a satchel Joey Lee had been carrying and found their .45 inside. This time, Sergeant Joe Coffey, Detective Frank Pergola, Artie Ruffels, and a few others secretly stole into the Long Island jail cell where Vito was at and signed him out, kidnapping him essentially from the other cops and taking him to Manhattan to Walter Mack's office, where they surrounded him in a room. Walter Mack then asked Vito, "Okay, Vito, what do you want in exchange for your cooperation?" Vito replied sadly, "I just want to be put in the same cell as Joey Lee." The officers laughed. This cold asshole actually had a sentimental side to him after all. Then Walter said, "Okay, well, I'm sure that can be arranged." And so Vito then began spilling out secrets. Horrible secrets. Dismemberments that he had seen. Murder after murder. All the while eating cheeseburgers, hot dogs, and pizza that the cops had given him. He just kept eating and eating away. Nobody had expected him to eat that much when he ordered all that. And he ate while rambling like a child, with his mouth open, about all these murders. And these murders were the most horrific murders that the NYPD had ever heard of. They hadn't heard anything like this. Coffey would later conclude, "That's the most despicable human I've ever met, but he sure has given us a lot of important information." And yes, Vito was about to become one of the most important cooperators in federal history. Just a few days later, Vito sat in the back of their car while Harry and Murphy drove out to Long Island, and there Vito would show him where Freddy and Richie had left Scorny's corpse in that barrel. By then, Roy would have already tried to do damage control and contacted Vito through his lawyer, Shargell, but Vito would have promptly rejected that. No, he'd rather go the informant direction. He didn't care about Roy. Roy, well, he'd be horrified. He'd already read in the papers just how much Vito had promised to spill, and he knew what that meant. Vito Arena was arrested on Saturday night, June 5th, 1982. By Sunday, Mack's task force had stolen him into the DA's custody. By Wednesday, Scorny was being pulled from the filthy murk, his skeleton still intact, and his wallet was dripping next to him. When they opened the barrel, it was still legible 3 years later. Now, elsewhere and afterward, in Brooklyn.
Every night after doing surveillance on the mob, across New York City and even New Jersey, Detective Kenny Mccabe would return home early in the morning and trudge wearily down into his basement, where he kept thousands of photos, notes, and reels.
He and the other guys working for the DA were excited.
They were planning something big, something a lot bigger than Roy, something even bigger than Nino, and something even bigger than Paul Castellon himself, though still a secret. But right now, Kenny couldn't help but notice how many pockets Roy had his chubby fingers in. He could bring down the whole mob with what he knew, and he was obviously a lot more afraid of going to prison than he pretended to be. Now, Vito's arrest had been huge. It was all over the papers. Vito was a headline. He was rambling about dozens of murders for the mob and selling drugs and stolen cars, and it was all connected to Canarsie, Roy's domain. Nino would be reading this, and his eyes were going to expand wider than a frying pan. And so would Castellano. It was highly dubious all these murders had been sanctioned. Nino was going to be pissed. He didn't know about all this, let alone Paul, who considered most of the behavior Roy was engaged in disgrace. Right now, Paul was finding out that everything he was worried about Roy, his worst fears, were true. This guy's a psychopath, and a massive amount of crimes that Paul had never even known about, let alone committed, were about to snake their way back up to him in the form of charges, through Vito's confession, to Roy, and then through Rico, to Nino, and then back up to Paul. Roy had been acting like a maniac and breaking so many rules for so long. Nino and Paul might be fucked. It was only a matter of time before Roy was either in a cell looking at life in prison, or more likely, Paul sanctioned a hit on him. Roy was going to end up in a trunk. That was, unless Mccabe could convince him to come over to his side before his friends got him first.